Story, and that of course happens to be what are the economic costs that India can impose on China. Clearly, the amount of trade that India does, the amount of trade deficit that India has with China has been for a number of years now a big sore point as far as the Indian government is concerned and Indian companies are concerned. Question is, can India diversify that, move away a large part of its import dependence to other countries? And if that is easier said than done, then what other options does India have?
On the day of India's bloodiest clash in 53 years, China's Great Wall Motors signed a $1 billion MOU with the Maharashtra government to set up a plant near Pune. It's a reality check on the dependence India has on China in throes of the COVID-19 crisis. India has been vocal about reducing dependence on imports, being more vocal about local and becoming self-reliant.
दुनिया को विश्वास होने लगा है कि भारत बहुत अच्छा कर सकता है। सवाल यह है कि आखिर कैसे? इस सवाल का भी उत्तर है 130 करोड़ देशवासियों का आत्मनिर्भर भारत का संकल्प।
But here's the reality. In financial year 2019, India's trade deficit with China was $53.6 billion. That's close to 2% of GDP. China constitutes 9% of India's exports, but only 18% of imports.
India is a pimple on the Chinese economy. Canceling a few contracts here or there, it would be a rounding error for the Chinese economy. India does have an issue that it has to ask itself, which is how vulnerable does it want to be, given that China has shown itself to be willing to use economic power to punish or to reward. So, for example, does India want to have supply chains or particularly technology where it is vulnerable?
We import capital goods, intermediates, and manufactured goods from China. What we export is mainly iron ore and agricultural products. China is making its presence felt in the new economic space as well. Venture Intelligence estimates that Chinese investors, which include Tencent, Alibaba, and TR Capital, have invested $5.5 billion in Indian startups over the last 5 years. 18 of 30 Indian unicorns have at least one Chinese investor. Alibaba has invested in Paytm and Zomato. Tencent has put money into Swiggy, Ola, and Byju's. Chinese smartphones have a 70% share of the Indian market. The Chinese government-backed paper Global Times in an editorial warned India that it does not fear conflicts at the border. It has a reason to be confident. China's military spending is the second largest in the world after the United States. In 2019, China was estimated to have allocated $261 billion to the military compared to India's $67 billion. It has 1,232 fighter aircraft, more than double India's 538. China has 33,000 armored vehicles. India has 8,686. Among naval assets, China has 74 submarines, India has 16. This attack could be a message from China, not just to India, but to the United States. India put Chinese investments on approval with its changed FDI policy. India withdrew from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership trade negotiations in November. It's part of the anti-China Quad of the United States, Australia, and Japan. But India will have to reduce its economic and military imbalance with Beijing if it wants to stay in the game.
All right, so can India reduce its import dependence really on China? And more importantly, what other economic costs can India impose on China? Bishwajit Dhar is a professor for the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at JNU, and Harshil Mathur is co-founder and CEO at Razorpay. Thank you very much, both gentlemen, for joining us and also for your patience. Let me start with you, Professor Dhar, first. You have argued in a recent interview and in recent articles that yes, while on the one hand, because of the prevailing geopolitical situation, it might be a good idea to cut import dependence on China. That is easier said than done. Can you elaborate for our viewers why that may be the case?
Yeah, actually, India has substantial dependence, as the clip just said, and our dependence is on very critical areas. For instance, the entire telecom sector and electronic, large part of the electronic components we import from China. So the entire digital India, the ambitions that we have is critically dependent on the equipment that we buy from China. The other, and I think the more disturbing dependence that we have is on pharmaceuticals. The active pharmaceutical ingredients are imported from China. And although, India calls itself the pharmacy of the world, we have this soft underbelly in the sense that, we are importing these critical intermediates from China, and then we are merely producing the formulations. So, and there are many more areas, but these two are really...
if that is the case, and I agree with you, I mean, it won't be easy cutting imports in those two areas, or, in a large variety of areas, but what other avenues are available to India to impose economic costs on China?
No, I don't think at this point it's possible. I think, what India has to do is to, sort of reduce the stranglehold that China has on the Indian economy. And for a number of years, we have actually been saying that, the dependence on one country of this nature, and that too on China, is not really a very comfortable situation for India to be in. So I think, what we are, the government is talking now, and I hope that they're done earlier. But in any case, better late than never.
So tell me this, Professor Dar, if we were to diversify some of these imports, what would be the countries in the ambit, South Korea, Japan, and what may be the extra cost burden that might incur?
No, unfortunately, I don't see any countries in the horizon which can actually supply the kind of the quantity that we need. For pharmaceuticals, there are none. China has emerged as the only, major supplier of APIs.
Okay.
And India actually is providing formulations to the whole world. So I don't think there is a way out for us to diversify, and that's the problem that we have now got caught. And the only thing that you can do is to think about a medium-term,
Let me now go across to Harshil Mathur. He's the CEO and the co-founder of Razorpay. A lot has been said, particularly about the startup space, Harshil, about how the big unicorns in India have big-ticket Chinese investment. Obviously, again, that's not an area you can suddenly or overnight change, because clearly investors have long-term horizons. These companies also have long-term sort of gestation periods and so on and so forth. The question is, how do you reduce dependence on Chinese money and, of course, on Chinese imports? Professor Dhar has given out an elaborate set of reasons why it's easier said than done. But in your space, in the startup space, how difficult or easy would that be?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It will definitely not be easy. The fact is that India doesn't have a significant sized domestic venture market. You don't have enough venture funds in the domestic space. So Indian startups definitely need foreign investment. The question is that whatever happened historically, but question is that going forward, can we reduce the dependence on a country like China? And can we start looking at other countries? And in the venture funding space, I agree with Professor on the import side, but in venture funding space, I believe we have enough alternatives. We have a large venture ecosystem in the US. We have Singapore, we have Japan, we have Korea. We have enough venture ecosystems available across the world that can easily replace the Chinese venture market for us.
Why has there been so much Chinese investment in the Indian startup space? Is it because their money is cheaper, or they've just moved in faster than the others? Why is that the case?
Yeah, the physical distance matters a lot. It's easier for a Chinese investor to come to India, meet a lot of startups, invest very quickly, versus somebody from US coming in. I think in general also a lot of large Chinese companies have led a lot of these investments. So the difference between US venture market and Chinese venture market is in China, it's the large corporates leading that. You have companies like Alibaba, Tencent, Xiaomi doing that in a big way. versus US, where you have pure financial venture funds. And somewhere corporates work much more faster compared to venture funds, and that's why they have been able to win a lot of that. I think, but at the same time, if we take a strong stance and if companies decide to find replacements for it, it's not that hard. There is enough and more capital available across the world that can easily take care of the delta.
All right, let me go back to Professor Dhar. One area again has been electronic appliances, particularly mobile phones and so on. Does it make sense to make a distinction between Chinese brands or Chinese companies that are selling in India their products as opposed to, let's say, an iPhone or any other phone of a multinational, a Samsung phone, for example, parts of which may be made in China, but ultimately it's owned by an American company or a South Korean company, in this case, for example?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Actually it's a matter of perception. Now, if you start looking at most of the things that we consumer electronics that we use, many of these are actually manufactured in one way or the other with Chinese, with the Chinese help, because Chinese are really dominating the entire value chain here, the production networks. So how would the Indian consumer look at this? It's a question of perception. So when the sentiments are so high that the sentiments against China is so high, there may be a tendency for us to actually look inside where iPhone is manufactured, and there could be a pushback even on iPhone, because we have also seen as a part of this Atmanirbhar kind of this approach that there have been calls to boycott foreign products.
Economic costs that India can. Okay. Let me go back to Harshil in terms of what is the road ahead for Indian startup space. Obviously, most of these companies are in their gestation period, as it were. But if you were to take a longer term view, Harshil, when do we see Indian companies, the big names, the big names in India, the big industrial houses, be in a position where they can begin to invest in these Indian startups? We're not dependent on whether it is Chinese money or Singaporean money or American money.
I think Indian startup ecosystem is still fairly nascent compared to US or China, and it will take some time. Like we had the first batch of unicorns come out in last couple of years. Before that, we didn't have much, and it will take some amount of time for these companies to reach a scale where they can IPO, they can become financially independent, where they can start looking at doing some of these things themselves. And for that, we need a lot of support from the ecosystem. Today, the fact is that the domestic venture ecosystem in India is still fairly weak, and I think that's something that the government can help a lot on creating enough funds in the domestic market so that companies in India don't have to look for markets, not just China, but even US and Singapore and other markets. And I think for that, there's a lot of policy help that is required. Otherwise, it will take a long time.
Are there technology sort of solutions that these Chinese companies bring? And therefore, let's separate it into two parts. Money, yes, money is one part of it. But are there also technological support and technology, cutting edge technology that they bring, which is also one of the reasons why startups are dependent on Chinese companies?
Not too significantly. Most of the startups and the large unicorns, if you pick them up, while there has been Chinese investment, most of the technology has been developed in-house. Most of these companies are built in India. They have large teams in India. They're developing for India. I think the only reason you have to turn to China or US is because there's not enough domestic capital available. I think if we can solve for that to some extent, I think the technology part is not that hard. We have enough talent in the Indian ecosystem to build it ourselves.
Professor Dhar, coming back to building our own indigenous manufacturing supply chain, as it were, and I think one good example, and we had a lot of auto company representatives over the course of the last many weeks, and this was, of course, in the context of the pandemic, how they are managing supply chains because everything was shut. One interesting development that we saw was that most of the big players have their supplies sourced indigenously from indigenous suppliers. Well, it might be a different matter that those suppliers might be, sourcing some parts from China or other countries and so on. Given the emphasis on, Make in India that we've seen over the last 5 years, and now for a self-reliant India and Atmanirbhar Bharat, do you think it's possible to entirely indigenize supply chains in industries like auto in particular? Telecom might be some distance away, but auto in particular, to completely fully indigenize supply chains in a way that everything is manufactured in India?
Auto to a very large extent we've already done, because the ancillarization that was done after Suzuki and Hyundai came in, and this was a part of the policy that the government of India had of indigenization. We had this phased manufacturing program, and any foreign investor coming here had to set up these ancillaries. So it was part of the program, and it is now standing us in good stead, because a lot of sourcing is being done from within the country. So I think somewhat of that kind we need to do, and I would also jump in here and talk a bit about the resources issue that Harshil was mentioning. That we have over the years turned too easily towards foreign capital, and we haven't actually made efforts to garner domestic resources, and I don't see how India can't actually garner its own resources. Why should we actually just fall just fall for foreign capital, and because there are costs attached, like we are now seeing. So if we do that, if we can get our act together, both in terms of resources, and the other important aspect is also technology, and I don't see how India can't match the best in the world, given the kind of the manpower that we have. We have skilled manpower. There is no reason for us to lag so behind China. China is now the leading country on the technology scene, but it's awful that we are lagging so behind.
All right.
So I think it's very important for the government to get a fix on resources, on technology, and then the other thing will fall in place. You can actually get a domestic manufacturer in place once you get the other two fixed.
Okay, arms fixed. All right, we'll leave it at that. Professor Dar, as well as Harshil Mathur, thank you very much, gentlemen, for speaking with us, your perspective, and of course, once again, for your patience, for waiting around with us. Thank you so much for speaking with us. So there you go. It's easier said than done, but there are alternatives there where India may be able to pursue certain avenues which could, if not impose economic costs, but certainly send out a clear signal to China that what has happened is not acceptable, and India too has levers of trade and economy to try and bring pressure to bear. We'll take a break. When we come back, more news and updates. Welcome back. This week began with the worst bloodshed on the India-China line of actual control in over 50 years. Tonight, Prime Minister Modi delivered a strong message to the nation and to China after he concluded an all-party meeting, saying that no one can lay a finger even on 1 inch of Indian territory.
हम सभी देश की सीमाओं की रक्षा में दिन रात लगे हमारे वीर जवानों के साथ चट्टान की तरह खड़े हैं। उनकी वीरता, उनके कौशल, उनकी सूझबूझ पर देश अटूट विश्वास रखता है। मैं शहीदों के परिवारों को भी ये विश्वास दिलाता हूं कि पूरा देश उनके साथ है, पूरा देश उन्हें नमन करता है। न वहां कोई हमारी सीमा में घुस आया है, न ही कोई घुसा हुआ है, न ही हमारी कोई पोस्ट किसी दूसरे के कब्जे में है। लद्दाख में हमारे 20 जाबाज शहीद हुए, लेकिन जिन्होंने भारत माता की तरफ आंख उठाकर देखा था, उन्हें वो सबक सिखा कर गए हैं। निश्चित तौर पर चीन द्वारा एलएसी पर जो किया गया है, उससे पूरा देश आहत है, आक्रोशित है। हमारी सेना देश की रक्षा के लिए कोई कसर नहीं छोड़ रही है। डिप्लॉयमेंट हो एक्शन हो, काउंटर एक्शन हो, जल थल नभ में हमारी सेनाओं को देश की रक्षा के लिए जो करना है वो कर रही है। आज हमारे पास ये कैपेबिलिटी है कि कोई भी हमारी एक इंच जमीन की तरफ आंख उठाकर भी नहीं देख सकता।
So the Prime Minister there categorical that not an inch of Indian land has gone to Chinese or Chinese occupation. That's a wrap of Brass Tacks. Thanks very much for tuning in. But news and updates continue right here on CNN News 18.